Hey guys, and welcome back. If you're new around here, hi, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms I talk about true crime and history and social experiments and weird medical mysteries and basically anything that scratches that nerdy itch in my brain. And it's been a while since I've recorded one of my listicle episodes. I used to do a lot of these and for some reason they just fell by the wayside, but today I'm changing that. In these episodes I talk about a number of different cases, all of which pertain to a single topic. And today we're talking about mass hysteria. Over the years, I've talked about quite a few cases of mass hysteria here on the internet. I've done the medieval dancing plague or the dancing mania, the Tanganyika laughing epidemic, even the Salem witch trials can fall under this category. And I find these kinds of cases so interesting to research, but they're actually fairly rare. They don't happen all that often. And when they have happened throughout history, there's not usually enough sort of information about them to make a whole episode. Hence today's listicle kind of video or episode. It depends whether you listen to this on podcast or not. Today we're talking about 4 cases of mass hysteria that actually happened throughout history, and we can discuss whether or not we think hysteria really can be put down as the main reasoning behind these events. Or is it just a lazy way to dismiss them? Could something deeper be going on here? Just how powerful is the human mind? First up though, let's talk about what mass hysteria actually is. It's often defined as a social illness or a conversion disorder or mass psychogenic illness. It refers to an outbreak of unusual and uncharacteristic behaviours, thoughts and feelings, or sometimes even physical health symptoms shared among a group of people. That's what Healthline defines it as. People affected by mass hysteria typically believe that something specific has triggered these symptoms. They don't have any underlying health conditions that could explain these symptoms away, they don't usually behave in such a way, and they may have an extreme fear of an exaggerated or non-existent threat. Experts today generally recognise 2 types of mass hysteria, the first of which is mass anxiety hysteria, which tends to show up among people who belong to the same close and usually quite isolated community. The symptoms usually consist of sudden tension and other anxiety symptoms like chest pain, dizziness, headaches, fainting, and those symptoms spread among a group and then resolve themselves fairly quickly. The second type is mass motor hysteria, which tends to show up among people experiencing sort of more long-term stress and tension. It involves irregular motor symptoms, it moves from person to person, and often lingers for weeks on end. So think twitching and shaking, partial paralysis, uncontrollable laughing or crying, and altered speech patterns. It's thought that mass hysteria spreads through word of mouth and through just seeing other people suffering. People in these periods of great stress, for whatever reason, see or hear about somebody else with symptoms, and then they begin experiencing these symptoms themselves. Now, it's important to note that this is not something that people are aware that they're doing. The people suffering aren't aware that the symptoms are simply psychological. They are genuinely suffering. And I suppose the most simple way to explain it is if somebody around you says they feel nauseous and suddenly you start feeling nauseous too, even though you were fine 10 minutes ago, you convince yourself that it must be spreading. Think that kind of thing, but on a much larger scale. The symptoms here are very, very real. And what's the difference between genuine symptoms caused by any other illness versus by mass hysteria? Is there any difference? The victim is still suffering. Okay, and with that, let's jump into my list of 4 real-life cases of mass hysteria, cases that you won't be able to believe actually happened. And first, we're going to head to medieval France for the story of the Meowing cat nuns. Yes, you heard that correctly. And very aptly, my own meowing cat is currently trying to climb my lighting. Say hi, Biscuit. Now, this story is one that's very hard to track down to its original source, as with many things that happened in medieval times, but our first written account of it comes from 1844's The Epidemics of the Middle Ages, written by J.F.C. Hecker in his native German, and then it was translated to English by Benjamin Babington. Somewhere along the way in the translation, meowing nuns are mentioned by Babington, and he wrote the story in his translator notes. He wrote, "I have read in a good medical work that a nun in a very large convent in France began to mew like a cat. Shortly afterwards, the nuns also mewed. At last, all the nuns mewed together every day at a certain time for several hours together. The whole surrounding Christian neighbourhood heard with equal chagrin and astonishment this daily cat concert, which did not cease until all the nuns were informed that a company of soldiers were placed by the police before the entrance of the convent, and that they were provided with rods and would continue whipping them until they promised to mew no more. Now, as a professional, it isn't entirely unbelievable that Babington would have read this in a medical work somewhere. He studied medicine, he had a doctorate. However, he didn't name the original source, and it's just very annoying. About 50 years beforehand, though, around 1780, Swiss physician Johann Zimmermann wrote in his book Solitude of a French medical writer of great merit and undoubted veracity, relates that in a convent of nuns where the sisterhood was unusually numerous, one of those secluded fair ones was seized with a strange impulse to mew like a cat, that several others of the nuns in a short time followed her example. So this is another source 50 years beforehand mentioning again the Meowing nuns, but again no actual source is named, just a French medical writer. So we're going off the words of these men, but for the sake of this episode, let's just pretend that it was a legitimate story. It was also mentioned in a couple of other texts from the time as well. It probably was real. We've seen weirder things. So one day in France, a nun starts meowing like a cat at her convent. More nuns join in, and eventually every single one is meowing at the same time every single day. Now, we don't have enough information to say whether or not this was a choice they made, if they decided to meow at the same time every day, or if this was something that couldn't be helped, but we can say the behaviour was distinctly un-nun-like. In the end, the only thing that stopped them was police and the threat of punishment. But news of the meowing nuns spread across Europe, and this wouldn't be the only example of nuns exhibiting odd behaviours. A 15th century German physician called Jerome Cardan was summoned to a convent one day to find a nun who had started biting the other nuns. And instead of just ignoring it, the nuns started biting back until every nun was biting anyone in the vicinity. And then that also spread to other nunneries, with Cardan writing at the time. The news of this infatuation among the nuns soon spread, and it is now passed convent to convent through a great part of Germany, principally Saxony, and afterward it visited the nunneries of Holland, and at last the nuns had biting mania even as far as Rome. Religious leaders, of course, presumed the devil had taken over, urging the nuns to pray and hold mass, and then when that didn't work, they turned to exorcisms. Regular leaders, like the city leaders, punished them with floggings and imprisonment, but no one quite knew what was going on. Perhaps it was a prank or the nuns acting out in rebellion. Centuries later, Zimmermann would hypothesise that this was the influence of solitude on the mind, which is probably quite a decent theory. We know that isolation and solitude can do horrible things to a person. It's not how the human brain is designed. But then he goes on to write that the female mind is still more subject to these delusions of disordered fancy, for as their feelings are far more exquisite, their passions warmer, and their imaginations more active than those of the other sex, solitude, when carried out to excess, affects them in a much greater degree. Yes, women have always been thought to be much more prone to hysteria. And that actually brings us onto quite an interesting point around the word hysteria. There have been a lot of discussions about renaming this phenomenon as a whole, but it hasn't quite caught on yet. I debated naming this video something different, but nobody would know what I'm talking about. We're sticking with it, but there is discussion around it. Some prefer to use psychogenic illness or conversion disorder instead, but the word hysteria itself is defined as exaggerated or uncontrollable emotion or excitement, and it comes from the ancient Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Historically, hysteria has been a word used for women, disturbances of the uterus causing them to lose their minds. They thought that a woman's uterus literally wandered through their bodies, causing madness. So today, some don't like using the word for that very reason. It is a word used for millennia to punish women and dismiss legitimate medical claims. However, it's not necessarily used in such a way nowadays, especially in medical settings. Now it is just used for exaggerated emotions in either male or female patients, but the stigma does kind of remain. But I digress. Was this a case of mass hysteria? Were the nuns physically unable to stop themselves from meowing and biting? Did the isolation, the stress of being in such a religious community get to them? As we covered early on, stress is thought to be one of the main triggers of mass hysteria. And on top of all that, being just a woman in this time would have been stressful full stop. You'll often find that cases of mass hysteria tend to affect women more than others. The Meowing nuns, the Tanganyika laughter, the Salem witch trials. There was also a writing tremor epidemic from 1892 in which a schoolgirl got uncontrollable hand tremors that caused her to be unable to write, and those hand tremors slowly spread around the entire school. There was a lot of pressure on their handwriting having to be perfect, and they were punished if it wasn't, so they got this tremor. Now, unfortunately, there's no way of knowing if mass hysteria was the cause behind the nuns meowing, but it's not out of the question. This truly is something that could have happened. It's no crazier than any other example of mass hysteria, but we just don't have loads of information because it happened so long ago. The second case I want to talk about today is the Junebug epidemic of 1962, when a mysterious disease broke out in the dressmaking department of a textile factory in the southern USA. A female worker broke out in a bad rash, complaining of nausea and dizziness. The next day, multiple women and at least 2 men also reported the same symptoms. The factory just got a shipment of fabric over from England, and so the ill people claimed that the fabric must have been infested with bugs that bit them and caused the symptoms. Now, this event is referred to as the Junebug epidemic, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure where Junebugs come into this. They're a type of large bug that appear in, you guessed it, June. They are not a threat to humans directly, they're not going to bite you, but they are annoying and very loud. They're a very tasty treat for other predators like spiders and wasps, so if you have a Junebug infestation, you'll also have a spider and wasp infestation. Their larvae will destroy your grass and shrubs, the adults will eat your trees and plants. They are just a nightmare, but they don't bite humans and cause illness. Over the next 4 days after the first couple of people had got ill, the media caught onto this story and they sort of sensationalised it a little bit, of course. 62 out of 900 workers at this mill would come down with this illness, either having to receive medical attention or miss a day at work. So it's not like every single person at this mill came down ill, but 62 out of 900 is a decent amount. That's like almost 1 in 10. Was it any more than might have come down with a common cold or a stomach bug? I don't know, probably around the same. But with so many people coming down with this mysterious illness, the managers did decide to close the mill to look for the source. Health officials from the mill and the Communicable Disease Centre of Atlanta closed it down. They searched everywhere and they found only 2 biting insects in the entire plant. And they wouldn't have caused such widespread illness. But regardless, they did spray the entire mill just in case. They also looked for any pollutants that could have caused it, and they found nothing. And the symptoms experienced by the ill people were nothing like any doctors had ever seen before. In the end, both the mill management and local authorities put this down to mass psychogenic illness, saying there couldn't possibly have been any other cause. And after a while, people did just stop getting ill. Of course, the workers were very sceptical of this, but what more could they do? They thought they were genuinely ill. Everyone was telling them it's all in their heads, but they've got physical symptoms. How does that work? They were all fine in the end. There was no lasting symptoms, and so the authorities put down anxiety as the main cause. Authorities never found a bug in the mill, nor have they ever found just any bug full stop that causes symptoms similar to the ones shared between the victims here. But it's important to note that the mill here was a very stressful environment to work in. The plant had only recently opened, it was very busy, and management just wasn't the best. Everything was badly organised. When questioned, most of the workers who got ill said that they'd been experiencing very high levels of stress at work. So yeah, it kind of does fit the bill of mass hysteria, genuine symptoms brought on by stress and societal pressure. Other people were ill, so they are too. But also, I just don't think it's out of the question that it could have been a genuine bug. And by bug, I mean like illness bug, stomach bug, not bug. For case number 3 today, we're going to be heading to Singapore in the late 1960s with the shrinking penis panic. Yes, you heard that correctly. I thought this one would be fascinating to talk about because, as I mentioned earlier, mass hysteria often affects female populations. This one is found much more predominantly in men. This mass hysteria focuses around something called Coro Syndrome or genital retraction syndrome because of course this affects men and their genitals, there is a genuine name for it, unlike when mass hysteria hits women. Coro Syndrome is characterised by a person's anxiety over their overwhelming belief that their sex organs are retracting and disappearing into their body. They also believe that this retraction is fatal and they are going to die soon, despite there not being any actual physical changes whatsoever. The anxiety attacks that come along with Coro can last anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days, whilst more chronic sufferers can be affected for decades, for a lifetime. The diagnostic criteria here consists of a patient reporting genital retraction with no actual evidence, fear and anxiety, and physical attempts to prevent or reverse this retraction. Some Coro patients feel weak, they experience insomnia, so just general anxiety symptoms, as well as excessively measuring their penis and attempting to physically pull it out of their abdomen. Did you think this episode was going to be taking this turn? I bet not, but here we are. So this is a genuine mental delusional disorder listed in the DSM, but in the 1960s in Singapore there was a mass outbreak, unlike anything ever seen before. It was October 1967 when a 16-year-old male was rushed to hospital. He was said to be frightened and pale, pulling on his penis to prevent it from disappearing into his abdomen. He was sure he was about to die, so he was given some drugs and he slowly improved. His parents said the symptoms started at school that day. There was a rumour flying around about pork that had been tainted with swine flu vaccine and that was causing Coro. Early that morning, the boy had eaten a steamed pork bun. When he went to pee later that day after hearing the rumour, he looked down and saw his penis shrinking before his eyes. And this wasn't an isolated case. Over the next week or so, 469 cases of Coro would be recorded across Singapore. The hospitals were overrun with it. And that was just the recorded numbers in Western hospitals. There may have been many, many more sufferers who seek the help of Chinese medicine doctors instead. Coro became so prevalent in Singapore that the Ministry of Primary Production announced that swine flu and the vaccine were completely harmless to humans, but that didn't really make much difference. And so after a week, the Ministry of Health actually had to go onto the TV and radio to say that Coro was psychological, that no one had ever actually died from this, that your penises weren't actually shrinking. And then there was a media blackout. It wasn't to be spoken about in the media any further. And magically, cases immediately stopped being reported. All they had to be told was that it was psychological, that their penises weren't actually shrinking, and it stopped. It is truly magical how the human brain works. And in the rarer cases where simply being made aware wasn't enough, the men were treated with a course of alprazolam and imipramine, and hopefully their symptoms did subside. And the case in Singapore isn't the only mass case of Coro that's been reported over the years. In November 1976 in northeastern Thailand, there were at least 200 patients treated at a local hospital. Here, only 2/3 of the sufferers were men. Coro can affect women as well, although it is obviously much rarer. In female cases, they generally report their nipples or their vulvas retracting back into their bodies, whilst all the other symptoms remain the same as men. Specifically, in this case in Thailand, the main symptoms for all were reported as fainting, shrinking, and or itching of the external genitalia, nausea, dizziness, abdominal pains, headaches, and facial numbness. The men reported impotency and the women reported frigidity, and all recovered after a very brief intervention. In Thailand's case, it's thought that the outbreak started thanks to paranoia over an ongoing feud with the Vietnamese. In a lot of cases of Coro, you can find xenophobia and fear at the root. The media reported it as being caused by the poisoning of Vietnamese food and tobacco. It was an attack on the sexual vitality and the health of the Thai people. Once again, once the media stopped reporting on it, the cases seemed to slow down. But the country Coro is thought to have originated in, and the country it's seen in the most, is actually China, with outbursts being reported in 1948, 55, 66, 74, 84, 85 and 87. And in the last couple of outbreaks, thousands of people were affected. But then, after the 1987 outbreak, mental health campaigns went out across China, and since then there's just been a general improvement economically in the country. AKA, stress was reduced and now it's much, much rarer. Nowadays, it's reportedly actually most common in India instead. In September 2003, there was a hysteria reported in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. A text chain spread around the country suggesting that if they shook hands with, shared a comb with, or received a verbal curse from a Zionist, their penises would melt away from their bodies in an attempt to stop the people of Sudan from reproducing. Local media then obviously also covered the story. One columnist wrote what I think was meant to be like a tongue-in-cheek column about an electric comb that could literally melt a penis off a person, but it wasn't really received as tongue-in-cheek and people thought it was real, and it just sort of like spread the word of Coro even more. It has been noted that the symptoms of Coro are different in different parts of the world. Like in Asia, you'll generally see the genital retraction noted most frequently. It's possibly thought to originate from ancient Chinese cultural beliefs. There are these ancient medical books talking about penises retracting into the abdomen and people dying, and that's probably where that comes from. Whereas for cases in the West, the genitals are usually stolen rather than shrinking. Apparently in the West, we have a lot of folklore about supernatural creatures and witches stealing genitals in the night, and that's reflected in our deepest, darkest fears. Culture, morals, religion all play a big part in Coro. For a long time, Coro was thought to be a culture-bound syndrome kept just to Southeast Asia, but nowadays we know that is not the case. Men all around the world suffer with this, albeit it is rare. And in sporadic cases, as in just like lone cases, it often comes along as a symptom of a deeper psychological disorder, like often schizophrenia. However, when it happens epidemically, as in huge groups suddenly experiencing symptoms, it is thought most often to be culture-bound thanks to deep beliefs rooted in historical literature or folklore. Time and time again, you see the same roots behind them. Some experts nowadays think that Coro reflects the greatest fear of men, a huge amount of their self-worth being based on their genitals, the size of their genitals, their ability to reproduce. If you can't perform in those areas, are you less of a man? This condition most often appears in young unmarried men, often sexually inexperienced men who hear and believe sex-related myths. And as generally is the case with mass hysteria, outbreaks of Coro usually happen in deprived and stressed societies, the men struggling to make ends meet and perhaps struggling to perform their societally deemed duties as men, aka to be the providers of the household, to be the man of the house. Gender roles, I'm not saying that I believe in at all, but the societal pressure is there, and apparently it can really get to some people. I feel like I should have saved that case for last because nothing is really going to beat it in this one, but we are going to fight on and talk about our final mass hysteria case for the day, and that's the Jello Factory panic from just around 2011-2012, happening in a small working class town in western New York called Leroy, not far from Rochester. This story started in October 2011 when a high school cheerleader called Katie Krautwurst woke up from a nap one day and found herself suffering with a very strange tic. Her head kept jerking forward uncontrollably. She thought it was just a muscle spasm that would soon pass, but it didn't. And as you can imagine, it was quite uncomfortable, so soon she ended up in A&E. As happens all too often when a woman presents with unusual symptoms or any symptoms at all, doctors dismissed it as anxiety. You know, that very well-known anxiety symptom of head jerks. It's very frustrating in this particular case because maybe you could argue that mass hysteria equals anxiety, as you'll come to see. But the doctors didn't know that at this time. It was just a teenage girl presenting with a very strange symptom and they didn't have any answers. So anxiety, it has to be. But it didn't pass, and a few days later she was back again getting more tests, with doctors in the end saying it was just a tic. But then a month later, with Katie still suffering, her best friend Thera also started suffering with a very odd illness. She woke up from a nap and found that she suddenly had a stutter. At a game she was cheerleading at that night, she couldn't get her words out at all. 2 weeks later, another girl called Lydia Parker also goes for a nap and wakes up stuttering. Both Lydia and Thera's symptoms get worse over the next few weeks, and eventually Lydia has flailing arms, numbness in her legs and blackout. She was even in a wheelchair for a bit. By mid-December, there were 12 girls suffering with this unexplained illness, all from one high school, and that number would eventually crawl up to 18. The symptoms of all were generally similar: twitches, spasms, vocal outbursts, stuttering, and apart from being at the same high school and all being girls, there weren't really many similarities between the sufferers. They were all from very different walks of life. But upon taking a closer look, it did seem like each girl had some sort of stress in their life. Sick parents, traumatic losses, abuse, there was always something. So doctors eventually diagnosed a conversion disorder, an illness in which the body expresses physical symptoms as a way to deal with emotional stressors, and that in turn becomes a mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria. You become worried about suffering with this unexplained illness on top of the stress you're already suffering, and then your brain makes it a reality. Of course, though, you can imagine that the parents weren't really willing to take this as an answer. It does feel like somewhat of a dismissal, doesn't it? Like your kids are clearly suffering with very physical symptoms of something, and the doctors are like, oh, they're just stressed. It's just the human brain being weird. Like, you're not going to take that as an answer because there's no easy fix there. There's no cure for conversion disorder or mass hysteria, it just stops eventually. Some of the girls were put on antibiotics in case it was a brain bacteria causing the symptoms, and this did seem to help, but how much of that was a placebo effect? Some did push for further investigation. Activist Erin Brockovich actually sent a team to Leroy herself. There was suspicion that a train derailment there in 1917 may have caused toxic chemicals to sit in the soil, and that could be causing the symptoms. And the superintendent of the school actually ended up blocking off the entire area. They stopped anyone from investigating anything on campus. And that just made people think they were hiding something. It just made people more suspicious, of course, as it would do. And this became nationwide news, and of course it did, because it is wild. The tiny town of Leroy suddenly had this huge amount of attention on it, and not for good reason. That just caused more stress for people living there, and therefore more symptoms. But eventually it just quietened down, and then it stopped. It stopped appearing in the media, people stopped talking about it, the girl's symptoms got better. Now you're probably wondering what the connection is here to Jello. I did introduce this as the Jello Factory panic. And that's because Leroy is known for being the birthplace of Jello, and it is where the original factory once stood. A woman called Ali Rowbottom is one of the surviving members of the family that owns Jello, and she has blamed her own family as being the cause of this illness. She said that herself, her mother, and her grandmother have all suffered with the exact same thing at certain points in their life, something her family call the Jello curse. They believe it's come from years of oppressive patriarchy and misogyny. Could the curse have spilled out to other girls in Leroy? Alice described how there's a long history of women in her family being physically and mentally abused by men, including horrific sexual assault, and that culminates in these physical symptoms, whilst the men in the family said it's because of the Jello money and women being too drawn for it and it drives them mad. Of course, it was apparently a punishment for the women. Ali's mother Mary has said that her role in the world was always defined by the men in her family. She was forced to live for men and not for herself, which led to her suffering with severe psychiatric episodes and very similar symptoms to the high school girls in 2011. As soon as she heard the story of these girls, she said she knew it was linked. It was no coincidence that it was all happening in Leroy. And the connections here are actually really interesting. The family says that Jello has always been steeped in the patriarchy. Its advertising technique has always been to target women, the homemakers, relying on the women being at home and preparing food for their children who love jelly, of course. Jello? Is Jello the brand name? Like jelly that I know as jelly is jam in the US, but what do you call jelly? Do you just call all jelly, as in the wobbly jelly, Jello? Is it like a Kleenex tissue or like Hoover vacuum kind of situation? Let me know in the comments. As the world evolved and women were allowed to step out of their homemaker roles, Jello as a brand began to struggle. They no longer had those key consumers and they struggled to keep up with the times. You could argue it's the patriarchy that caused Leroy to never grow from being this small town. The town eventually made the choice to keep the Jello factory running instead of preserving the nearby Ingham University, which was the first of its kind for women. There was no university and the factory did eventually shut down, causing the economy to suffer hugely, with no way of escape, no university for women. Of course, we're talking decades back now, but it takes more than a generation for a town to grow out of its oppressive ideals. Could all of this still be affecting the young women of Leroy today as late as 2011? An obsessive patriarchy, deep-rooted misogyny, unbelievable stress on the girls. Maybe it is a stretch, but it is undeniably fascinating to ponder on. These are deep-rooted issues, and external factors do influence us a lot more than we'd like to realise. So there you go, there are 4 cases of mass hysteria that I found absolutely fascinating. I tried to pick from like different periods of time, different places in the world affecting different groups of people, just so we could get a really solid overview of how mass hysteria can present in the world. It's a really interesting topic, isn't it? I'm sure we all like to think that our brains are better than everyone else's, that we'd be the person not affected by mass hysteria, but honestly, that's not how it works. That's not how the human brain works. We can't control external factors. We can't control how our brain is going to react to something as much as we would like to be able to. I've always found it fascinating how psychological things can manifest in such physical symptoms. Like when I'm suffering with anxiety, I get such bad stomach pains, like so bad it can cripple me and send me to bed. And sometimes the only way that I know that I'm anxious about something is because I'm suffering with my stomach pains. And it's crazy. There is so much more to learn about the human brain, and I wish I was one of those people who was doing the research, but alas, I'm not quite that smart. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you found this one interesting, then please make sure you leave a comment down below. Tell me if there's any other sort of like listicle style cases you want me to do. And I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.